The sun had just begun to climb over the small town of Brooksville, casting a golden hue across the quiet streets and the modest courthouse that stood at the center of the town square. Inside, the polished wooden floors reflected the morning light streaming through tall, narrow windows, and the scent of old books, waxed wood, and faint coffee lingered in the air. The courthouse had a rhythm all its own, the shuffling of papers, the echoing footsteps of lawyers and clerks, the occasional bark or whine from a nervous police dog in the hallways, and the low hum of conversation among citizens waiting for their cases. On this particular morning, there was an extra layer of tension, subtle but unmistakable, as the courthouse prepared for a series of cases that promised to be routine, yet emotionally charged in different ways. Amidst this busy backdrop, a tiny hand tugged at a much larger one. Lily, a 3-year-old with big, curious brown eyes and a soft mop of chestnut hair, clutched her mother's hand tightly as they navigated the bustling hallway. Her little sneakers clicked softly against the wooden floor as she tried to keep pace, though her attention darted to everything in the room. To Lily, the courthouse was less a place of legal proceedings and more a mysterious world filled with towering adults, black robes, shining badges, and the faint hum of authority. Every face she passed seemed stern and important, and yet, to her, none of it was frightening, only fascinating. Her mother, Jessica, balanced a folder of papers in one arm while holding Lily's small hand in the other. She tried to keep her attention on the schedule for the day, checking that they would be in the right courtroom at the right time. Jessica had been to the courthouse many times, but today felt different. Perhaps it was Lily's presence. Perhaps it was the way the courthouse seemed to hum with a quiet expectancy. Either way, Jessica felt a nervous anticipation, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. "Careful, sweetheart," she whispered, gently guiding Lily around a man in a sharp suit who was hurrying down the hall. Lily nodded seriously, her small brow furrowed in concentration, and continued scanning the room with wide-eyed wonder. Her gaze fell on a figure that immediately caught her attention. A police dog sitting near the courtroom entrance, alert but calm, next to its handler. The dog's coat gleamed in the morning light, and its deep, intelligent eyes seemed to assess everyone who passed. Lily's lips parted slightly, and she whispered, "Doggy," tugging lightly at her mother's hand to draw her attention. Jessica smiled softly, sensing the innocence in her daughter's observation. "Yes, honey, that's a police dog. Very brave," she said, her voice gentle. Lily's eyes widened, sparkling with curiosity. She took a small step forward, then another, drawn toward the dog as if by an invisible thread. The handler noticed the child's approach and knelt down slightly, giving her a reassuring smile without breaking protocol. It was a subtle gesture, but to Lily it was an invitation, a sign that the dog was friendly. As Lily approached, other observers began to take notice. A few lawyers paused mid-stride, exchanging quiet, amused glances. The judge, seated behind his bench reviewing notes for the upcoming cases, noticed a slight disruption out of the corner of his eye. He didn't pay it much mind at first, after all. Children often visited the courthouse, and most were restless or fussy. But there was something different about Lily. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if she understood more than a 3-year-old ordinarily could. Her small fingers reached out toward the dog, trembling slightly with excitement, and she whispered to her mother again, "Hi, doggy." The officers watching the dog could hardly suppress their smiles. Here, in the midst of legal paperwork, arguments, and the daily grind of law enforcement, was a reminder of the world outside rules and procedures, a world of curiosity and innocence. They exchanged quiet murmurs, watching the tiny girl approach, sensing that this small, simple act might leave a larger impression in any case that morning. Meanwhile, Lily's mother guided her daughter carefully, but allowed her enough freedom to interact. Jessica's heart swelled with pride and a hint of anxiety. What if Lily got too close? What if the dog reacted unpredictably? But as she observed the dog's calm, steady demeanor, and the gentle way the handler crouched to welcome her daughter, her worries began to fade. This was no ordinary dog. This was a trained officer, capable of maintaining composure in the most chaotic of situations, and yet it seemed to respond to Lily's innocence with an almost human gentleness. Time seemed to slow. The courthouse noise faded into a soft backdrop as observers' attention gravitated toward the unexpected interaction. Lily, standing barely 3 feet tall, extended her tiny hand, brushing it lightly against the dog's soft fur. The dog's ears twitched slightly, and it let out a soft, approving sigh. A small, almost imperceptible wag of its tail caused a ripple of quiet amusement to move through the nearby spectators. The judge looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly and then softening as he took in the scene. There was a lesson here, he realized, one that wasn't in any manual of law. The simplicity of innocence could pierce even the sternest hearts. Lily's fascination grew. She knelt carefully beside the dog, her hands moving tentatively as she stroked its fur. She giggled softly, a high-pitched musical sound that cut through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. "Good dog," she whispered, her words small but deliberate. That phrase, so simple, so unremarkable in isolation, carried a weight the adults around her could hardly articulate. In that moment, the courthouse, a place defined by rules, regulations, and rigid authority, paused. Eyes shifted. Smiles formed. Even the judge found himself leaning forward slightly, wiping the corner of his eye unconsciously. Officers exchanged quiet nods. Lawyers paused mid-conversation. The spectators, many of whom had been grumbling about the slow pace of proceedings, leaned in slightly, captivated. A 3-year-old girl had managed what few could, to hold the attention of an entire room filled with adults who normally never stopped to notice such small things. The power of innocence, untrained yet profound, had entered their space. Lily's mother watched, her heart thumping, as the realization settled in. Her daughter had done something remarkable without even knowing it. She had reminded everyone present of the beauty of trust, the charm of simplicity, and the unexpected impact of tiny gestures. And so, the courthouse morning, which had begun like any other, had transformed. Something extraordinary had quietly unfolded, heralded not by arguments or rulings, but by the curiosity and kindness of a 3-year-old girl. As the judge cleared his throat to begin proceedings, he allowed himself a small, private smile. Today, he realized, the law could wait a few moments longer. Today, he would watch and remember how a little girl and a police dog could momentarily change the world, one soft word and gentle touch at a time. The courthouse had settled into an unusual quiet, a hush that only the unexpected can bring. Lily's tiny hand still hovered near the police dog's fur, her eyes wide and shining with wonder. The dog, a majestic German shepherd with a sleek coat and sharp, intelligent eyes, sat calmly, its ears twitching occasionally as if acknowledging the tiny visitor. The handler, Officer Ramirez, kept a careful but relaxed watch. Years of training had taught him that this dog could sense more than human words alone, that its instincts often picked up on emotions, an ability that made this encounter extraordinary. Jessica bent slightly, whispering to her daughter, "Be gentle, honey. Remember, he's a police dog." Lily nodded seriously, as if she fully understood the weight of that statement. Then, with a small giggle, she reached out and patted the dog's head again. "Hi, doggy," she murmured. It was a simple greeting, yet it carried innocence so powerful it seemed to ripple through the room. A few nearby spectators, previously engaged in their own mundane worries, paused to watch, a smile spreading across their faces. Officer Ramirez, kneeling beside the dog, offered a reassuring nod. "Go ahead, little lady," he said softly. "He's friendly." Lily's face lit up, and she leaned slightly closer, her hands moving carefully across the dog's thick coat. The dog responded with a soft, approving wag of its tail, the muscles in its body relaxing, as if it understood this was no ordinary interaction. The reaction in the courtroom was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A lawyer adjusting his tie looked up from a folder and froze, watching the child's careful movements. A juror, previously tapping impatiently on the bench, tilted her head, her frown softening. The judge glanced over the top of his glasses, initially dismissing the scene as a minor distraction. But the sight of the 3-year-old and the police dog captured his attention in a way that surprised him. There was a purity here, a reminder of why humanity mattered beyond rules and regulations. Lily crouched slightly, her tiny fingers brushing gently against the dog's strong neck. She whispered, "Good dog," again, this time with more confidence. The words were simple, yet they carried a resonance that the adults felt more than they heard. Conversations around the courtroom seemed to pause mid-sentence. Even the clerks, usually absorbed in paperwork, looked up with faint smiles. The atmosphere, heavy with procedural rigidity moments ago, now shimmered with warmth and quiet wonder. A few reporters, stationed discreetly in the back of the courtroom, began to take note, their pens moving swiftly across pads of paper. They recognized an unusual story in the making, not a sensational headline, but one that captured something human and relatable, a reminder that hope and innocence still existed in the most unlikely places. A 3-year-old had managed to quiet an entire room without demanding attention, without speaking more than a few words. Her presence alone was magnetic. Lily's mother, Jessica, felt her heart swell with a mixture of pride and astonishment. She had brought her daughter to the courthouse for a routine matter, never expecting this level of fascination or attention. Yet, watching Lily interact with the dog, seeing the calmness in the animal's response and the soft smiles from adults around them, Jessica felt something shift. It was as if the room itself recognized a fleeting moment of pure goodness, one that would linger long after the morning's cases were over. Officer Ramirez shifted slightly, speaking softly to the dog. "Good boy, Max. See? She's just a little girl. Nothing to worry about." Max, the police dog, responded with a soft sigh and a gentle tilt of his head, as if acknowledging the officer's words. Lily's tiny hand moved again across his fur, and the dog allowed it, nuzzling slightly. The interaction, so innocent yet so profound, captured the attention of everyone in the room. Even hardened officers who had seen countless tense scenarios paused to witness the bond forming between child and canine. A soft murmur spread through the courtroom. "Look at that," whispered a juror to their neighbor. "She's not afraid at all." Another visitor smiled quietly. "It's amazing how calm he is with her." The judge, meanwhile, observed with increasing focus. He had spent decades presiding over disputes, listening to arguments, and weighing evidence. Rarely had he seen such unfiltered honesty and simplicity command the room's attention. He felt a tug at his heart, a reminder of a world outside strict rules, legal jargon, and the endless cycle of cases. The child's fascination continued, her voice occasionally breaking the silence with quiet, innocent words. "Sit," she said gently to Max, mimicking the commands she had seen the officer give. The dog, trained and disciplined, responded instinctively, lowering his body slightly without any hesitation. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, witnessing the fluid, almost magical interaction. The simplicity of Lily's intent, just playing, just observing, just interacting, carried a weight far beyond what anyone could quantify. Jessica knelt slightly beside her daughter, her eyes glistening. "Lily, remember to be gentle," she whispered again. Lily nodded, her focus unwavering. The way the little girl's attention stayed on the dog with such pure curiosity, made a profound impact. Even the most serious adults could not ignore it. There was no malice, no fear, only genuine engagement. The moment felt suspended in time, as though the courthouse itself had paused to watch, to remember what innocence could achieve. Then quietly, Lily extended her hand once more and brushed it along Max's nose. The dog leaned slightly into the touch, a gesture so small, yet so emotionally potent, that several adults felt their throats tighten. It was a reminder of the connection possible between humans and animals, and the way empathy could flow without words or instructions. Observers found themselves smiling, nodding subtly to one another, acknowledging that a simple, heartfelt gesture could momentarily outweigh the weight of adult concerns, rules, and responsibilities. Officer Ramirez straightened slightly, giving the child an encouraging nod. "You're very gentle, Lily. That's perfect," he said. The courtroom, now fully attuned to the unfolding scene, seemed to breathe collectively, a quiet wave of appreciation and wonder washing over everyone present. The judge's hand rested lightly on his notes, eyes fixed on the small interaction that had grown into a shared experience. No one spoke, no one moved. They simply watched, silently acknowledging the power of innocence and trust. Lily giggled softly, a sound that rippled through the room like a tiny bell. Max responded with a gentle wag of his tail, and even the most rigid spectators found themselves smiling. Jessica whispered, "That's my girl," her voice full of awe. The morning's proceedings, once defined by formalities and strict schedules, had transformed into something remarkable, a shared human experience. A 3-year-old girl and a police dog had created a bridge between authority, law, and pure, unfiltered kindness. By now, whispers had begun to circulate through the courtroom, quiet but pervasive. Lawyers, clerks, and spectators exchanged knowing glances. "Isn't that something?" a man whispered to his neighbor. "She's so fearless." "And look at him," another responded. "Even a trained officer like Max can't help but respond to her." The judge, recognizing the subtle shift in the room's energy, leaned back in his chair for a moment. This wasn't part of any legal manual, yet it was perhaps more important than any case he would hear that day. Lily, completely absorbed, stood up slowly and gave Max a final pat. "Bye-bye, doggy," she said softly. Max responded with a small, affectionate nuzzle against her hand before returning to his handler. The courtroom released a collective exhale, almost imperceptible, yet deeply felt. For a brief, shining moment, the tension, seriousness, and rigid procedures of the courthouse had yielded to wonder, empathy, and human connection. A child had reminded everyone present of the power of simplicity and the beauty of observing, noticing, and responding with kindness. Jessica squeezed her daughter's hand, smiling through tears she hadn't realized had formed. The judge adjusted his glasses, his eyes moist, a small tear threatening to escape. Officer Ramirez straightened Max's harness, exchanging a knowing glance with the courtroom officers. Everyone understood that something extraordinary had just occurred, a fleeting, yet unforgettable intersection of innocence, trust, and compassion that would remain etched in memory long after the morning's cases concluded. And so, in a courthouse that had begun the day with routine and procedure, a 3-year-old girl and a police dog had woven a quiet, enduring story of empathy and connection. The ripple of that encounter had just begun, and no one present would ever forget the morning when innocence paused time itself. The courthouse, once buzzing with the normal clamor of legal proceedings, seemed to shift into a different rhythm. Every adult present had been subtly drawn into the scene unfolding at the courtroom entrance. Lily, the 3-year-old with the mop of chestnut hair and the soft giggle that now filled the room, crouched near Max, the police dog, her small hands brushing gently over his fur. The dog, trained to respond to commands and read the emotions of humans, sat calmly, tilting his head slightly, as though acknowledging the child's presence. The entire room had become an audience to this extraordinary moment. Jessica knelt beside her daughter, holding her hand gently to ensure she didn't move too quickly, but mostly she watched, fascinated. She could feel the collective attention of the courtroom focused on Lily, the judge, whose stern demeanor usually commanded respect through authority alone, found himself leaning forward on his bench, his eyes softened, watching a moment unfold that was more human than legal. It was as though the laws and rules of the world had paused, making room for something far more profound: innocence. Then it happened. Lily lifted her tiny voice, barely above a whisper, but clear in its intent. "Good dog." The words were simple, almost unremarkable in any other context, but in that moment, they reverberated through the courtroom like a ripple across still water. Time seemed to pause. A lawyer adjusting his papers froze mid-sentence. A clerk holding a pile of files tilted his head, unsure whether to continue his work. The judge's pen hovered above his notes as he blinked, trying to comprehend the quiet power of a 3-year-old's observation. The room had been tense, filled with procedural monotony and the weight of daily responsibilities. But Lily's small, heartfelt words cracked through it all. The dog responded in the smallest, yet most profound way. Max's tail wagged ever so slightly, his eyes softening, his head lowering in a gentle acknowledgement of Lily's words. Officer Ramirez, kneeling beside him, gave a small approving nod, whispering quietly, "Good boy." The courtroom collectively exhaled, as though the tiny canine had confirmed what everyone present already felt. This was a moment worth pausing for. Spectators began to exchange glances, a few smiling quietly, some whispering to their neighbors. One juror, a woman with tightly coiled hair and a stern expression, laughed softly under her breath. "Look at that," she whispered. "He trusts her." Others nodded, caught in the quiet magic of innocence meeting discipline, simplicity meeting authority. A child's voice, soft and clear, had created a bond between human and animal that seemed to bypass all formalities and reach directly into the heart. The judge's chest tightened, and he cleared his throat softly, trying to maintain composure. Years of courtroom experience had taught him to control his emotions, to enforce order and objectivity, to weigh facts with detached precision. But Lily's voice, her tiny hand resting lightly on Max's neck, bypassed all that experience and struck straight at something long buried in him: the memory of childhood wonder, the purity of unfiltered kindness, and the reminder that life could still surprise with unlooked-for beauty. A small tear pricked at the corner of his eye, which he hastily brushed away with the back of his hand. Officer Ramirez chuckled softly under his breath, amused and moved. He had worked with Max for years and had witnessed countless tense situations, but never had a routine morning in a courthouse turned into something so quietly miraculous. "You see that?" he whispered to a fellow officer. "Even a trained police dog can't resist pure innocence. It's like he knows her heart." Max, as if understanding every word, leaned slightly into Lily's touch, nuzzling her hand gently. Jessica's heart swelled with pride and amazement. She knelt closer, her voice soft. "Lily, you're so gentle," she said. Lily turned, her wide eyes meeting her mother's, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Doggy nice," she replied simply, and that simplicity seemed to carry more truth than any speech or argument in the room. Adults paused, realizing how often their own lives were cluttered with unnecessary complications, and how refreshing it was to witness unfiltered honesty. Even the lawyers, who usually measured every word and gesture, found themselves leaning forward slightly in their chairs. Their cases, their strategy, their deadlines all temporarily faded into the background. A single, Heartfelt phrase from a 3-year-old had commanded their attention, more completely than any argument they could make in court. One lawyer whispered to another, "I didn't expect a child to teach a lesson today." The other nodded silently, eyes still fixed on Lily and Max. Lily's small hands continued to move across Max's fur, and the dog responded with quiet patience and gentle acknowledgement. "Good dog," she repeated, each time with more confidence, each time carrying a warmth that made even the most skeptical adults pause. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted subtly. Tension gave way to awe, nervousness gave way to calm. This was no longer a simple interaction. It had become a quiet symphony of innocence, trust, and empathy. Nearby spectators began to whisper stories quietly among themselves. "My grandson would never be this brave," one remarked softly. "And yet, look at her. No fear at all." Another shook her head, smiling. "It's incredible how something so small can affect everyone around it. Even the judge looks different." The judge, for his part, remained at his bench, blinking back the moisture forming in his eyes, unable to disguise the quiet admiration he felt for the tiny girl who had brought life to the room. Then something remarkable happened. Lily, emboldened by the warmth and acceptance she felt, reached out to stroke Max's muzzle gently. "Hi, doggy," she said again, her voice carrying the authority only innocence can command. The dog leaned closer, his warm breath brushing against her fingers. The courtroom, silent in anticipation, seemed collectively to inhale, each person holding their breath to witness the moment. Even the officers who had seen countless interactions with children and animals alike found themselves quietly moved, their trained stoicism softened by the purity of the scene. The judge, finally speaking softly, allowed a rare smile to break his usual stern countenance. "Well," he murmured under his breath, mostly to himself, "that's something you don't see every day." He glanced around the room. Smiles were shared, whispers of admiration spread quietly, and the energy of the courtroom had transformed. A 3-year-old had managed to do what few adults could: capture attention, evoke emotion, and remind everyone present of the simple, unassuming power of kindness. Jessica squeezed Lily's hand, proud and awed. She whispered softly, "You're making everyone happy, sweetheart." Lily, unaware of the depth of her impact, simply giggled and repeated, "Doggy good." Max responded with a gentle wag of his tail, and the two shared a quiet moment that felt timeless. Around them, the courtroom buzzed quietly with wonder, not from scandal or surprise rulings, but from the heart of a child and the response of a loyal, trained companion. Finally, Officer Ramirez stood slightly, straightening Max's harness. "All right, little lady," he said softly. "You've made his day, and maybe ours too." Lily waved at Max, giggling. The judge, clearing his throat, gently reminded everyone to return to their business, though it was clear that no one's mind had fully left the image of the small girl and the police dog. Something extraordinary had occurred, a fleeting moment that would be remembered long after the morning's cases concluded. For Lily, it was simply another day of exploration, another encounter that sparked joy. But for the adults around her, it was a reminder. The smallest voices often carry the greatest power. In the quiet, disciplined space of the courthouse, a child's words had stopped time, touched hearts, and created a memory no one present would ever forget. The judge, a man whose reputation for strictness and composure preceded him, remained seated behind the high bench, his eyes fixed on Lily and Max. He had presided over countless cases, divorce hearings, criminal trials, custody disputes, yet none of them had prepared him for this. The courtroom, usually a place of tension, legal jargon, and procedural monotony, now pulsed with quiet emotion. The judge's hands, usually steady and decisive, rested lightly on his notes, his fingers tapping unconsciously as he watched the child's gentle gestures. Lily's soft words, "Good dog," echoed in the room and seemed to touch a hidden part of his heart. Years of experience had trained him to remain detached, to measure facts without emotion, to ensure that justice was blind. But as he observed the small, 3-year-old girl kneeling before a police dog with pure, unguarded curiosity, he felt a shift. A lump formed in his throat, an unfamiliar constriction that made him swallow hard. The innocence before him, unpolished and uncalculated, was something rare, something he had not encountered in decades of legal work. Here, amid the formality and authority, was something entirely human, untainted by procedure or expectation. Lily's tiny hands continued to move across Max's thick coat, her fingers brushing gently over the dog's fur. Each movement was deliberate, yet instinctual, a perfect blend of curiosity and care. The dog, trained to respond to commands and read human emotions, sat patiently, tilting his head as if acknowledging Lily's presence. He seemed to understand that this interaction was sacred in its own quiet way. For the first time that morning, the judge felt the weight of the courtroom's environment shift, not because of arguments or evidence, but because of something far more profound, the unassuming power of innocence and empathy. Around the room, observers noticed the judge's change in demeanor. His usual stern posture had softened. The corners of his mouth lifted subtly, and his eyes, often cold and analytical, held a glimmer of emotion. Officers and clerks exchanged quiet glances, recognizing the rare human moment unfolding before them. Lawyers paused mid-motion, their pens hovering over legal pads as they watched. Even the spectators, who had arrived with their own worries and distractions, leaned slightly forward, captivated by a display of humanity that transcended the rules of court. Jessica, kneeling beside Lily, whispered gently, "Lily, remember to be gentle." Lily nodded, her gaze unwavering, her tiny lips curving into a soft smile. "Doggy nice," she replied simply, and the judge felt his chest tighten again. These words, unadorned and sincere, carried more weight than any eloquent argument he had ever heard from a lawyer. The room, heavy with procedure and responsibility moments ago, now seemed lighter, almost suspended in a delicate, heartfelt stillness. Officer Ramirez shifted slightly, keeping Max calm and attentive. "Good boy, Max," he murmured under his breath. The dog leaned slightly into Lily's touch, as if acknowledging the gentle approval. The judge, observing this silent communication between child and canine, felt tears threaten to escape. He had seen fear, anger, and grief in his courtroom countless times, yet this small, unassuming act of kindness held more power than all of those combined. In a world dominated by rules and arguments, here was simplicity pure, effective, and transformative. The ripple effect began to spread further. A juror, previously tapping impatiently on the bench, stopped and smiled, her eyes softening. A clerk paused in organizing files, a faint chuckle escaping her lips. The lawyers, whose minds were trained to focus on evidence, strategy, and deadlines, found themselves captivated by a child who had no agenda beyond connection. Whispers moved quietly among spectators. "She's so fearless. And look at him." Even a trained police dog responds to her. The sentiment was unanimous. The world had momentarily shifted, guided by innocence and trust. Lily, sensing the warmth of attention, but remaining oblivious to its significance, reached out again, brushing Max's muzzle lightly. "Hi, doggy," she said softly, her words carrying a sincerity that seemed to ripple through the room. Max responded with a gentle nuzzle, a simple act that sent a wave of quiet emotion across the courtroom. Even the judge felt his shoulders relax, as if the child's presence had lifted an unseen weight. He realized that no legal precedent or ruling could replicate the profound effect of this simple human connection. Jessica whispered to her daughter again, "You're making everyone happy, Lily." The little girl looked up at her mother, eyes bright and innocent, and giggled softly. Her laughter was musical, infectious, and seemed to echo in the tall, polished halls of the courthouse. The judge, unable to conceal his reaction any longer, allowed a small tear to slide down his cheek. It was a private acknowledgment of the extraordinary moment unfolding before him, a testament to the transformative power of simplicity and love. Officer Ramirez straightened slightly, giving a small, approving nod to the courtroom. "You see," he said quietly to a fellow officer, "even Max can't resist her. She's got a gentle heart." Max's tail wagged ever so slightly, and his ears twitched, as though he understood the rare nature of the moment. The courtroom's attention remained fixed on Lily and Max, everyone silently acknowledging the magic in the air. A 3-year-old girl had paused a weight of authority, procedures and expectation with nothing more than kindness and curiosity. The judge, still wiping his eyes discreetly, thought of his own children, grown and living far away. He remembered their laughter, their tiny hands, their unspoken capacity to transform ordinary moments into something unforgettable. Now, witnessing Lily, he realized that the world often became too serious, too focused on rules, regulations, and expectations. Here was a reminder, delivered in the simplest form. Innocence could command attention, soften hearts, and remind even the sternest adults of what truly matters. Around the room, the emotional energy grew quietly but undeniably. Lawyers exchanged soft smiles, nodding to one another in unspoken agreement. Spectators whispered quietly, sharing stories of their own children or remembering moments of their own innocence. Officers, hardened by years of duty, felt a warmth in their chests they had not experienced in months. The courtroom, a place usually dominated by procedure and formalities, had become a theater of the human heart, all orchestrated by the smallest presence in the room. Lily, sensing no judgment, continued to interact with Max. Her voice, soft but confident, guided her actions. "Good dog," she repeated, brushing his fur with gentle care. Max, ever patient, leaned closer to her, allowing the touch. The judge watched quietly, understanding that this was more than a fleeting interaction. It was a lesson in empathy, trust, and the innate goodness present in all humans. He could not recall the last time a courtroom felt so alive, so tender, so undeniably human. Jessica squeezed her daughter's hand, proud and amazed at the child's natural confidence and gentle demeanor. "You're very kind, Lily," she whispered. Lily smiled up at her mother, giggling softly. The judge, still observing, realized that life's most important lessons were often taught outside of formal instruction. Sometimes, a moment of connection, a shared glance, a simple act of empathy, could move hearts and shift perspectives far more than 100 legal arguments ever could. And so, in that courthouse, on that ordinary morning, an extraordinary scene continued to unfold. A 3-year-old girl had captured the attention of adults trained to remain objective, disciplined, and detached. A police dog, trained to respond to commands and read subtle emotional cues, had connected with her in a way that was both instinctual and magical. And the judge, a man of authority, experience, and intellect, found his heart open in a way he had not anticipated. The ripple effect had only begun. Whispers of admiration, subtle smiles, and quiet chuckles spread across the room. The atmosphere had shifted from one of formality and tension to one of empathy, warmth, and connection. And at the center of it all, Lily and Max remained, a quiet pair whose simple presence reminded everyone that innocence and kindness could transform even the most rigid of spaces. The courthouse had transformed. What had begun as a routine morning filled with case files, legal arguments, and administrative monotony had become something far more extraordinary. Lily, still kneeling beside Max, the police dog, continued to pet him gently, her laughter soft, musical, and entirely contagious. The dog responded with quiet patience, his powerful body radiating calm. Every adult in the room seemed to sense that this was no ordinary interaction. It was a lesson, unfolding quietly, but with the weight of something profoundly human. Spectators, many of whom had arrived expecting the usual proceedings, found themselves smiling involuntarily. A juror who had been frowning earlier relaxed in her seat, leaning back slightly and nodding at her neighbor. "Isn't she amazing?" she whispered. The neighbor smiled softly, eyes fixed on the girl and the dog. "It's incredible how calm he is with her. Look at the way he's responding," she replied. The small crowd, initially distracted by mundane concerns, had become fully attentive to Lily and Max. The presence of innocence and trust had transformed the atmosphere. Jessica, kneeling beside her daughter, felt a rush of pride and awe. She whispered, "Lily, you're making everyone happy, sweetheart." Lily giggled, her small hand brushing across Max's fur again. She barely understood the significance of her actions, but her intuition told her that something special was happening. Her joy was simple, unfiltered, and radiant, and it illuminated the room in a way that no argument or procedural ruling ever could. Officer Ramirez, standing nearby, adjusted Max's harness slightly, his eyes following the little girl's careful movements. "You see that?" he said quietly to a fellow officer. "Even a trained police dog can't resist pure innocence. She's got a gentle heart." Max tilted his head and wagged his tail slightly, as if confirming Ramirez's words. The officer allowed himself a soft smile. In his line of work, he had witnessed countless tense situations, distress and fear, but rarely had he seen a moment of such pure connection. It was as if Lily had opened a door to a world where discipline and warmth coexisted effortlessly. The ripple effect spread quickly. Lawyers, usually preoccupied with their cases, paused to watch. Pens hovered over pads of paper, eyes lifted from contracts and statements. One attorney whispered to a colleague, "I didn't expect to be moved this morning." The colleague nodded silently, a small smile forming on his lips. Around the room, whispers of admiration and wonder circulated quietly. "She's so brave," someone murmured. "And look at him. He's completely calm." Even the judge, seated at his high bench, felt the emotional weight of the moment deepen. Years of rulings, arguments, and courtroom battles had honed his analytical mind. Yet this small child, and her gentle interaction with Max, had touched a part of him long dormant. He reflected on his own children, long grown and living far away. Their laughter, their small gestures of affection, and the simplicity of their joy came rushing back to him. He realized that the power of innocence and empathy was something that no amount of legal training could ever prepare him for. Jessica smiled as she watched her daughter, realizing that Lily had unintentionally created a bridge between worlds. The room, once filled with tension, hierarchy, and formality, was now a space where empathy reigned. Spectators leaned forward, whispering quietly to one another, sharing stories of their own children, or recalling moments when a small act of kindness had transformed their day. In those whispered exchanges, a quiet community of shared emotion formed, one that transcended titles, ages, and positions. Lily, sensing the warmth around her, continued her gentle interaction with Max. "Good dog," she murmured again, brushing her hand along his soft fur. Max leaned slightly into her touch, responding to her affection with calm, obedient acknowledgement. The scene was so subtle, yet so profound, that even the officers and courtroom, staff people trained to maintain composure in all situations, found themselves quietly moved. Their hearts softened, their expressions gentle, and the morning took on a warmth that had not existed minutes before. Nearby, a security officer who had been standing stiffly at attention shifted slightly, leaning on the wall as he watched the child. He thought of his own nieces and nephews, of the rare moments when life had surprised him with joy amidst responsibility. "It's amazing," he whispered to a colleague, who nodded in agreement. "Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that leave the biggest impact." Around the room, that sentiment spread like a quiet, invisible current. Smiles, nods, and soft chuckles became the language of connection, uniting people who had arrived as strangers. The judge, his hand resting lightly on his notes, allowed himself a moment of reflection. How often, he thought, had he overlooked the simple human elements in the rush of legal procedure? How often had he become so consumed by rules, deadlines, and strategy that he had forgotten the power of small, heartfelt actions? Watching Lily and Max, he felt a sense of humility and awe. Here was a child, unaware of her impact, teaching the adults around her a lesson in compassion, trust, and the beauty of unguarded humanity. The spectators, inspired by the moment, began to engage subtly with one another. One woman whispered to her neighbor about her own grandchildren, recalling their laughter and innocence. A man, previously frustrated by the slow pace of proceedings, smiled quietly, feeling unexpectedly light. The ripple effect was tangible. A room once defined by hierarchy and tension had become a shared space of empathy and joy, all because of the tiny hands of a 3-year-old and the calm presence of a police dog. Jessica squeezed Lily's hand gently, overwhelmed with emotion. "You're doing something amazing, Lily," she said softly. The little girl, unaware of the full magnitude of her impact, giggled and leaned slightly closer to Max. "Doggy nice?" she whispered again. And the sound was like a balm on the tension still lingering in the room. Max responded with a soft nuzzle, and the bond between child and canine seemed almost magical in its simplicity. Even the officers, trained to respond to high-stress situations with precision, allowed themselves to soften. They exchanged quiet smiles and glances, appreciating the way innocence could transform an ordinary morning. "It's a rare thing," one officer whispered to another, "to see someone this young touch hearts without even trying." Max's calm demeanor reflected that sentiment perfectly, as he continued to allow Lily's gentle touch, responding instinctively to her trust and care. Whispers of admiration spread further through the room. Lawyers, spectators, clerks, and even the judge found themselves sharing subtle glances of acknowledgement. It was as if everyone present recognized that the moment was fleeting, yet unforgettable. Lily, completely absorbed in her interaction with Max, had created something extraordinary. A bridge between people, between discipline and innocence, between responsibility and joy. The courthouse, typically a place of rigid structure, had been transformed by empathy. Finally, Lily stood, brushing her hands together, and looked up at her mother. "Bye-bye, doggy," she said softly. Max responded with a gentle nuzzle, and Officer Ramirez straightened his posture, smiling quietly. The judge allowed himself a faint nod, acknowledging the rare and beautiful impact of the tiny girl before him. The ripple effect had already begun, reaching beyond the courtroom into the hearts and minds of everyone present. For Jessica, the moment was surreal. Her daughter, unaware of her power to touch hearts, had reminded adults of the importance of kindness, empathy, and innocence. For the judge, it was a quiet revelation. Sometimes, the simplest gestures could leave the deepest impressions. And for the courthouse as a whole, the morning had shifted from ordinary procedure to a shared human experience, all because a 3-year-old girl had chosen to engage, to care, and to connect. And so, smiles spread across the courtroom, quietly but unmistakably. The ripple effect of Lily's small act of kindness had transformed a room of strangers into witnesses of something magical, something unforgettable. The power of innocence, empathy, and simple human connection had been revealed, and the memory of that morning would linger in hearts long after the courthouse returned to its normal rhythm. The courtroom had settled into a unique rhythm, one unlike any other day. The usual shuffling of papers, murmurs of impatient spectators, and low conversations among lawyers were now punctuated by a quiet, collective awareness. Everyone in the room, from clerks and officers to jurors and lawyers, carried a subtle, shared realization. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. The 3-year-old girl, Lily, had transformed an ordinary morning into an unforgettable lesson in empathy, kindness, and human connection. Spectators began to speak softly among themselves, their voices hushed but tinged with awe. "I didn't expect to be so moved today," one woman whispered to her companion. "It's amazing how someone so small can have such an effect." Another added, "And the dog. He's completely calm. He trusts her completely." The murmurs reflected more than curiosity. They reflected genuine wonder. Everyone had felt the ripple of innocence and trust spreading across the room, a reminder of what often went unnoticed in adult life. Jessica knelt beside Lily, her heart swelling with pride. She watched her daughter brushing Max's fur gently and whispering sweet words. "Good dog," Lily murmured again, each time with more confidence. Jessica realized that her daughter had become a symbol in that moment, a living example of the way simplicity, empathy, and innocence could touch even the most stoic hearts. Around them, whispers of admiration continued, quietly building into an atmosphere of shared human connection. Officer Ramirez, standing with Max at his side, observed the subtle transformations around the courtroom. Years of training had taught him to notice human behavior and read body language, but he had never seen such a visible, unified shift. Lawyers who had been rigid and focused now leaned back in their chairs, smiling quietly. Spectators who had entered distracted or frustrated were now leaning forward, eyes wide, absorbing the unexpected magic. Even the judge, renowned for his composure, had wiped a tear from his cheek and remained quietly observant, reflecting on the rare impact of a small child's presence. One juror, a woman in her 50s who had initially seemed disinterested, whispered to her neighbor, "I remember my granddaughter's first visit to the park. She had the same wonder in her eyes." The neighbor smiled softly, nodding. "Yes," she replied, "there's something about children. They remind us of what we forget as adults. Simple acts, pure intentions, make the biggest difference." Around the room, small nods and soft smiles confirmed that this sentiment was shared widely. Lily, without understanding it, had become a catalyst for reflection. The ripple effect reached even beyond the immediate witnesses. A few reporters, sitting quietly in the back, had been taking notes. They scribbled feverishly, capturing not only the events, but the emotions that permeated the room. One wrote, "In a world defined by rules, deadlines, and expectations, a 3-year-old's innocence has reminded us all of the simplest truths. Kindness matters, empathy matters, and connection transcends age." Another reporter quietly murmured to her colleague, "This isn't just a story about a courtroom or a police dog, it's about humanity, distilled into its purest form." Even the courthouse staff, accustomed to monotony and routine, were caught up in the subtle magic. Clerks paused mid-task, watching as Lily gently patted Max's head and whispered affectionate words. A bailiff shook his head in quiet disbelief. "It's incredible," he whispered. "I've seen kids in courtrooms before, but never anyone with this kind of presence or effect." The soft energy of admiration and wonder spread through the room like a gentle current, invisible but undeniable. The judge, reflecting on the scene, felt a rare vulnerability. He had spent decades teaching others about law, fairness, and justice, but he realized that there were lessons beyond the legal codes, beyond statutes and precedents. There were lessons in human connection, in innocence, in empathy. He glanced down at Lily, kneeling beside Max, and allowed himself a small, private smile. "Sometimes," he murmured softly, The simplest gestures speak louder than any argument, any ruling, or any legal text. Jessica, sensing the deep attention of those around her, whispered to Lily, "Honey, everyone is noticing how kind you are." Lily smiled, giggling softly, still brushing Max's fur. She didn't understand the magnitude of her actions, but instinctively, she felt the warmth radiating from the adults around her. Each gentle word, each soft touch, seemed to carry meaning far beyond her comprehension. The room, once filled with formality and routine, had become a space of reflection and shared humanity. Officer Ramirez, adjusting Max's harness slightly, spoke quietly to another officer. "It's remarkable," he said. "He's trained to read emotions, but even Max seems to understand the depth of her presence. She's tiny, but she's made an impact on every person here." Max tilted his head slightly, as if confirming the officer's observation. Every subtle movement of the dog seemed to mirror the emotions of those around him, reinforcing the idea that this was more than a child's play. It was a lesson in trust and empathy that transcended species. Spectators continued to whisper quietly among themselves, sharing personal reflections. "I wish my children could see this," one murmured. "They'd understand the value of patience and kindness." Another added, "Even in the most ordinary places, miracles happen. We just have to notice them." The small murmurs became a quiet chorus, a shared recognition of the extraordinary impact of Lily's simple acts. Each person in the room carried away a piece of the magic, a reminder that innocence and empathy were more powerful than many realized. The judge, observing all of this, felt a deep sense of connection to the room. It was as though the courthouse itself had shifted, temporarily transformed by the presence of a 3-year-old girl and a patient police dog. He reflected on his role in society and the responsibility of guiding not just through law, but through example, empathy, and understanding. Lily, unaware of the profound influence she wielded, had offered him and everyone else a moment of clarity, a glimpse of what truly mattered in the midst of duty and routine. Finally, Lily stood, brushing her hands together and looking up at her mother. "Bye-bye, doggy," she whispered softly. Max responded with a gentle nuzzle, and Officer Ramirez gave a quiet, approving smile. The ripple effect had reached its peak. The courtroom, touched by innocence, kindness, and trust, seemed lighter, warmer, and more connected. Observers felt a shared sense of joy, a recognition that even small, ordinary acts could ripple outward in ways that profoundly affect the world. Jessica hugged Lily gently, tears forming in her eyes. "You've made everyone so happy, sweetheart," she whispered. Lily smiled, oblivious to the emotional storm she had stirred. She had acted purely from instinct, curiosity, and kindness, yet the result was transformative. Adults, officers, clerks, lawyers, and even the judge had been reminded of the power of empathy and the lasting impact of small acts of love and trust. And so, in that ordinary courthouse, on that seemingly ordinary morning, extraordinary connections had been forged. A 3-year-old girl had captured hearts, touched souls, and reminded everyone present of the unassuming power of innocence. The courtroom, for a brief, shining moment, had become a place of wonder, empathy, and shared humanity, an enduring testament to the magic that exists when one acts from a place of pure, uncalculated love. The courthouse had returned, in its exterior routine, to the hum of official proceedings, but the energy within remained altered. The quiet reverence that had been cultivated by Lily's innocent interaction with Max lingered in the air, like a subtle fragrance that refused to dissipate. Even after the child and her mother had left the bench, the emotional impression had taken hold. Officers exchanged knowing glances. Clerks walked a little taller, and the judge sat at his bench, still absorbing the weight of what had occurred. Judge Thompson, a man whose reputation for firmness had earned both respect and fear over decades, remained seated long after the courtroom emptied. His gaze rested on the now empty area where Lily had knelt. He rubbed his eyes, and a faint tear traced down his cheek, unnoticed by anyone outside his office. He reflected on the simplicity of her actions, on the small words, "good dog," and the unassuming touch of a child that had paused the flow of logic, authority, and procedure that usually defined his everyday. In his quiet office, he replayed the scene in his mind. Lily's chestnut hair falling over her forehead as she leaned toward Max, her tiny hands brushing his fur, and her soft voice speaking words that carried a magnitude he could barely articulate. He thought of the dog's calm, patient demeanor, the silent acknowledgement in his intelligent eyes, and the way the child's innocence had drawn admiration and reflection from everyone present. A warmth spread through the judge's chest, unfamiliar, yet welcome, a quiet, profound reminder of what had been missing from his long years of authority. Pure, unfiltered human connection. Judge Thompson reached for his phone, hesitating before typing a brief note to the local newspaper. He wanted to ensure that what had happened wasn't just recorded in memory, but shared, a testament to the small but transformative moments of life. A 3-year-old child and a police dog remind us all what kindness looks like, he typed. In a room defined by law and procedure, innocence paused time itself. He paused, rereading the words, unsure if they could capture the depth of the emotion he had felt. Yet he pressed send, hoping that the story, as small as it might seem, would ripple beyond the walls of the courthouse. Within hours, the story began to spread. Local reporters, inspired by the unusual and heartwarming tale, began interviewing spectators, officers, and even the courthouse clerks who had observed Lily's interaction firsthand. One reporter, sitting in the quiet of the newsroom, typed fervently, "In an unexpected morning at the Monroe County Courthouse, a 3-year-old girl's gentle words and touch calmed a police dog and reminded everyone present of the power of innocence and empathy." Witnesses say smiles, quiet whispers, and even tears followed the tiny child's encounter, creating a ripple effect that touched hearts across the courthouse. Social media amplified the story. Images of the empty courtroom were accompanied by reflections from adults who had witnessed the moment. "Sometimes the smallest humans teach us the biggest lessons," one post read. Another shared, "A 3-year-old girl, a police dog, and the quiet power of innocence." This is humanity at its best. Within hours, the tale of Lily and Max began to reach beyond the town, inspiring hearts in neighboring counties and eventually farther afield. Back in the courthouse, officers and staff began to recount the story repeatedly. Sergeant Miller, a man who had spent 20 years in law enforcement, smiled as he spoke to a colleague. "I've seen plenty of things on duty, but nothing like that. That little girl reminded everyone in that room of why we do this work. It's not just about rules, it's about people." His colleague nodded in agreement. "And the dog?" Max responded like he knew it mattered. There was something real in that connection. Even the judge found himself revisiting the moment in private reflection. The legal system, he realized, had its rules and protocols. But these small encounters reminded him why law existed in service of humanity, not as an end in itself. Lily's simple, sincere words and her unguarded actions reminded him that the best lessons often come from unexpected places. He could almost hear her voice again. Good dog, simple and yet infinitely profound. News outlets began to contact Jessica for interviews, as she hesitated at first. She had never imagined her daughter's curiosity and kindness would become a public story. But seeing the joy and inspiration that Lily had sparked, she agreed. Cameras and microphones were carefully positioned as she recounted the morning. Lily didn't understand what she was doing, Jessica explained. She just wanted to be kind to Max, but in that moment, she reminded everyone present what love, trust, and empathy can do. The story resonated deeply with readers and viewers alike. Many adults reflected on their own lives, realizing how rare it was to pause, connect, and act with uncalculated kindness. Letters poured into the local newspaper and courthouse from people across the state, teachers, parents, even other judges, all expressing admiration and sharing personal stories of children whose innocence had reminded them of humanity's better side. The ripple effect that had begun in a small courtroom now extended far beyond its walls, touching communities in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, Max, the police dog, became a symbol of quiet patience and empathy. Officer Ramirez recounted the morning to his colleagues. "I've trained dogs for years, but I've never seen one respond like Max did that day. He sensed her trust, her innocence, and he mirrored it perfectly." It was a reminder that animals, like humans, feel and reflect the energy around them. His colleagues nodded, reflecting on how rare it was to witness such a harmonious interaction between child and canine. Lily, unaware of the magnitude of her actions, continued her normal routines, her days filled with play and learning. Yet her tiny gesture had already changed the world of adults around her. The judge, officers, spectators, and even reporters carried the memory of her innocence in their hearts, often recalling her words and gestures when confronted with the pressures and monotony of adult life. The courthouse, for a brief and shining moment, had become a place of inspiration, a place where humanity had been gently reminded of its better instincts. The town's residents, learning of the story through local media, began to share it among neighbors, in schools, and at community centers. Children and adults alike were captivated by the tale of a small girl whose simple kindness transformed a room and reminded a community of empathy and trust. Some wrote letters to the courthouse, others sent small gifts of thanks to the officers, and even to Lily's family, expressing how inspired they had been. The story had become more than a morning's news. It had become a reflection on the power of small human gestures in everyday life. Judge Thompson, reflecting on the widespread reaction, realized that this was more than a courtroom moment. It was a societal one. He thought about the letters, the calls, and the news coverage, understanding that the story of Lily and Max had awakened something in the town, something simple yet profound: hope. Adults who had grown cynical or overwhelmed by responsibilities now remembered the importance of connection, of empathy, and of seeing the world through the eyes of innocence. And so, what had begun as a quiet, ordinary morning in the courthouse had grown into a narrative that touched hearts far beyond the courtroom walls. Lily, through her gentle words, her unassuming gestures, and her curiosity, had reminded everyone that even the smallest voices could make the greatest impact. Max, the loyal police dog, had reflected that trust and patience perfectly, amplifying the effect. Together, they had created a story that would resonate in the town, the courthouse, and the hearts of all who heard it for years to come. The courthouse, usually a place defined by structure, routine, and solemnity, had settled into a quiet calm. The echoes of Lily's small voice and Max's gentle presence lingered in the hallways, carried in the memories of every person who had been present that morning. While the official business of the day continued, there was an undeniable shift, a subtle but permanent change in the hearts of those who had witnessed the extraordinary interaction. The power of innocence, trust, and uncalculated kindness had left its mark. Judge Thompson sat quietly at his bench, reflecting on the morning's events. He had seen countless cases, disputes, conflicts, and heartbreaks, yet none had touched him the way this small, gentle moment had. He thought of Lily, her chestnut hair falling softly over her forehead as she leaned toward Max, and of the dog's calm, patient responses. Her words, simple, "good dog," reverberated in his mind, carrying with them more meaning than any legal argument, testimony, or verdict he had ever presided over. For the first time in decades, the judge allowed himself to openly acknowledge the emotions swelling inside him. A single tear slid down his cheek, unnoticed by the few staff remaining in the courtroom. It was a tear born not of sadness, but of awe, gratitude, and the profound beauty of a child's innocence. He realized that justice, law, and procedure were important, but the moments that touched the human heart, small, sincere, and unguarded, were equally essential. He had witnessed a lesson in humanity that no courtroom manual could provide. Outside the courthouse, the town had begun to awaken to the story. Social media posts shared images and descriptions of Lily and Max, along with the heartfelt reactions of the judge, officers, and spectators. Locals marveled at the tale: a 3-year-old girl, a police dog, and the quiet power of trust and kindness that transformed an ordinary morning into a moment of shared humanity. Teachers in local schools read the story aloud to children, highlighting the importance of empathy and gentleness. Parents discussed it with their families, recognizing the reminder to nurture kindness in the youngest members of their households. Officer Ramirez, still standing by Max, reflected on the ripple effect of the interaction. "I've trained hundreds of police dogs, and I've seen countless interactions with children, but nothing like this," he said softly. "She didn't just touch Max, she touched all of us. It's a rare gift, that ability to reach hearts without trying, without planning, simply by being kind and present." Max, sensing the significance, leaned slightly against Ramirez's leg, as if acknowledging the officer's words. Jessica, carrying Lily in her arms as they left the courthouse, felt a swell of pride and humility. Her daughter had no idea of the impact she had made, yet her gentle gestures had touched the hearts of countless adults, inspired the town, and even moved the judge to tears. "Lily," she whispered softly, "you've reminded so many people how beautiful kindness can be." Lily giggled, her small fingers brushing over Max's harness as he followed beside them, completely at ease with her presence. The media coverage intensified. Local news outlets aired segments highlighting Lily's gentle interaction with Max and the emotional responses of the courtroom. Viewers across the region were captivated, many leaving comments describing their own memories of moments of innocence and connection. Letters poured into the courthouse and the newspaper, expressing admiration and gratitude. Some adults wrote of how they had been reminded to slow down, to nurture empathy in their children, and to seek out the simple joys that often go unnoticed in the rush of daily life. Even the children of the town began to feel the influence of Lily's story. Parents recounted how their kids, inspired by Lily, approached pets with more gentleness, offered comforting words to friends, and practiced acts of kindness that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Classrooms were filled with discussions about empathy, compassion, and the impact of small gestures. In playgrounds, children whispered stories about the brave little girl who had touched hearts far beyond her years. Judge Thompson, meanwhile, continued to reflect privately. He drafted a letter to be placed in the courthouse archives, recounting the day and emphasizing the enduring lesson he had learned. On this day, a 3-year-old child reminded us all of the profound power of innocence, empathy, and kindness. Let this record serve as a reminder that while laws guide our society, it is compassion and humanity that truly bind it together. As he wrote, he smiled softly, knowing that the moment would remain etched in the courthouse's memory forever. A ripple effect even reached City Hall. Community leaders and educators began discussing ways to honor the moment and inspire similar acts of kindness in children. Programs were proposed to teach young people about empathy, to encourage gentle interaction with animals, and to reinforce the value of sincere, unguarded gestures of humanity. All of this stemmed from the courage and curiosity of one small child and the calm presence of a loyal police dog. Days later, the courthouse organized a small ceremony to recognize the extraordinary morning. Max and Officer Ramirez were invited, and Jessica brought Lily along. The courtroom, now familiar with quiet awe, welcomed them warmly. Judge Thompson addressed the attendees with sincerity. "We are reminded today," he said, "that even in spaces dominated by rules and responsibility, a small act of kindness can ripple far beyond what we imagine. Lily has taught us a lesson we will not forget." The attendees, moved by the tribute, applauded gently. Lily, standing beside her mother, giggled and reached out to pat Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically. Tears shimmered in the eyes of adults who had witnessed the moment months earlier, while new spectators absorbed the story, feeling its warmth for the first time. It was a shared experience of humanity, a quiet celebration of empathy and connection that transcended age, status, and expectation. Jessica embraced her daughter afterward. "You've changed so many lives, Lily," she whispered. The little girl tilted her head, eyes bright with curiosity, and whispered back, "Doggy happy." In her simplicity, she had conveyed more truth than any adult could articulate. Max, responding to the gentle energy, leaned close, his calm presence affirming the beauty of the moment. Judge Thompson watched quietly from the bench, his heart full. He realized that the courtroom, the town, and even the broader community had been transformed, not by legal arguments or dramatic rulings, but by a 3-year-old's courage to connect, to care, and to trust. The tear that slid down his cheek that morning had not been a moment of weakness. It was a testament to the enduring power of innocence, to the lasting change that small gestures can bring. And so, life in the town continued, but nothing would ever be quite the same. The story of Lily and Max became legend, recounted in schools, shared among neighbors, and celebrated in the hearts of those who witnessed it. A courthouse, once a place of strict procedure, had become a symbol of humanity. A police dog, trained for duty, had revealed the extraordinary effect of patience and trust. And a 3-year-old girl had taught a town and a judge the profound power of kindness. In the end, it was not the headlines or the ceremonies that mattered most, but the quiet, enduring change that took root in hearts everywhere. Smiles were shared more freely, empathy became a conscious act, and the lesson of innocence remained alive in the community. Judge Thompson, officers, clerks, parents, and children alike carried with them a simple truth, that the smallest voices often leave the largest impact, and that even in a world of rules and expectations, love, kindness, and connection will always matter most. And as for Lily, she continued to explore her world, giggling, learning, and loving unconditionally, leaving ripples of joy and warmth wherever she went, a gentle reminder that even the smallest among us can change the world.